I had lived on my family's ranch land for years before the HOA even existed, a sprawling stretch of rugged fields, weathered fences, and an iron gate that had been there longer than most of the homes in our county, and I always thought of it as untouchable, not just because it was legally mine, but because of the history carved into every post and stone, the legacy of my father's cattle drives and my grandfather's sweat under the blazing Texas sun. But all that changed the day the HOA formed in the subdivision that cropped up on the other side of my land, houses sprouting like weeds where open pasture once rolled uninterrupted, and at first I ignored them, thinking nothing they did in their tidy cul-de-sac world could possibly touch me, until I came home one evening to find survey stakes hammered into my soil, bright orange tape fluttering against the prairie wind, and men I didn't recognize unloading rolls of chain link, fencing from the back of a contractor's truck. And when I asked what in God's name they were doing, the foreman casually said they were just following HOA orders to secure the boundary, as if the boundary were theirs to define. And when I pressed further, he handed me a paper stamped, with the HOA's logo, a self-important letter declaring their intention to enclose what they called community-adjacent land for aesthetic consistency. Words so vague and smug, they made my blood boil, because the land they were trespassing on was mine, deeded and recorded decades before the HOA ever dreamed of existing. And yet here they were, hammering posts into the earth as though my history, my property, my rights meant nothing, and standing there in the fading sunlight, I realized this wasn't some mistake, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an audacious land grab by people who thought their petty bylaws could stretch beyond their subdivision, who believed they could strong-arm me into submission by sheer arrogance. And though I wanted to tear the letter up on the spot and chase those workers off with my shotgun, I held my tongue, because one thing my father taught me was never to. Fight a battle angry, fight it smart. And so I let them finish their work that evening, the fence stretching like a scar across my land, while I stood silently with my fists clenched, already planning, already calculating, because I knew something they clearly didn't. That in their greed, they'd fenced themselves into a corner quite literally, and soon enough they'd regret every nail, every wire, every arrogant word in that letter, because I wasn't just going to fight them, I was going to make them crawl. The morning after the fence went up, I saddled my horse like my father used to when he needed to think, the leather creaking beneath me as the sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, and I rode the perimeter of my land, in silence, watching how the chain link cut across natural boundaries that had been respected for generations, how it forced awkward angles across cattle paths and blocked the creek where deer used to drink at dawn. And the more I looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about aesthetics or some HOA whim. This was a deliberate act of encroachment, a move to claim control over what was not theirs. And as my horse's hooves crunched against the dry earth, I thought about the men behind it, the board members I'd only seen in passing, smug faces at HOA meetings held under a rented tent on weekends, the type of people who thought their little titles gave them dominion over everyone, and I knew I needed to see exactly how deep their arrogance ran. So I dug out my grandfather's lockbox, the one with deeds and maps inside, papers so old the ink had begun to fade, but every word still legally binding, and I spread them across my kitchen table, tracing boundary lines with my finger, seeing, in black and white, what I already knew in my gut. My property extended 50 yards beyond where they'd planted their first fence post, giving me not only the creek but the gravel road that served as the only convenient access route for their subdivision, a road that wasn't public but private, originally built by my father to move cattle trucks. And suddenly I understood the leverage I had. If they wanted their neatly paved community to function, they depended on my land more than they realized. Armed with that knowledge, I drove into town, stopping first at the county clerk's office to make certified copies of every document, then at the courthouse to request an official boundary confirmation, and each clerk I spoke to nodded knowingly. because this wasn't the first time they'd seen HOAs overstep, but as one old clerk put it, "Son, they don't know who they're dealing with yet." That line stuck with me, simmering in the back of my mind like a promise, because she was right. They thought I was just another rancher too stubborn or too tired to fight, but what they didn't know was that my entire life had been built on holding ground, literally and figuratively, and I wasn't about to let some clipboard warriors dictate terms on my soil. By the time I returned home, I'd already drafted a plan, and it started simple. I was going to remind them exactly whose land they were standing on. That evening, I parked my truck by the fence line where their construction ended and waited, and sure enough, around 6 o'clock, HOA Karen herself, the self-appointed queen bee of the board, strutted up in her pressed slacks and oversized sunglasses, clipboard tucked under her arm like a sword. And with her came 2 other board members, men with stiff backs and nervous smiles, the kind of men who nodded when she spoke and never dared interrupt. She looked at me standing there and had the audacity to say, "I hope you appreciate what we're doing to improve the neighborhood view," as though I should be grateful they'd scarred my pasture with steel and wire, and I couldn't help but laugh, low and sharp, because the gall of it was almost comical. I told her plainly that the fence was trespassing on my land, that I had deeds older than her subdivision to prove it, and that she needed to have it removed before I took matters further. Her smile didn't falter, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, that flash of recognition that she might have overstepped. Yet pride is a dangerous thing, and instead of backing down, she crossed her arms and said, "Our legal team has already cleared this project. If you have a problem, you can take it up at the next HOA board meeting." The way she dismissed me, as though I was a nuisance instead of the rightful landowner, lit a fire inside me, and I knew then I wouldn't just fight. I'd make them regret every ounce of arrogance dripping from her words. Over the next week, while they busied themselves with finishing touches, I worked quietly, hiring a surveyor to mark the boundaries with neon paint so bright it could be seen from the highway, a visual reminder that every inch of their new fence trespassed onto my property. When the surveyor finished, I invited the county sheriff to take a look, not because I needed immediate enforcement, but because I wanted a witness, someone official who could later testify that the HOA had built illegally on private land. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man who knew my family well, shook his head as he walked the line. "You've got them dead to rights," he said, "but knowing Karen, she won't give in easy." I smiled because that was exactly what I was, counting on. The more stubborn she was, the deeper the hole she'd dig for herself. And so, I let them continue. I let them finish their fence, let them spend their HOA dues and their volunteer hours building what they thought was a monument to their control, all while I quietly gathered evidence, laid legal groundwork, and planned my next move. Then came the day of the so-called grand. The fallout from my announcement spread faster than wildfire across dry prairie grass, and by the next morning, I couldn't even walk into the feed store without someone smirking and asking me if it was true that the mighty HOA had fenced themselves into a corner. Apparently, word had reached every corner of the subdivision overnight, and I imagined whispered conversations over wine glasses, neighbors leaning against mailboxes shaking their heads, and HOA members frantically emailing each other about how to spin the disaster. For me, though, the next step was simple: enforce my rights with patience and precision. I knew Karen and her board would try to bluff, maybe even threaten me with lawsuits, but I'd grown up in courtrooms defending water rights and land disputes, and I knew one simple truth: paper without land means nothing, and I had the land. Sure enough, on Monday morning, Karen showed up at the gate in her shiny SUV, sunglasses perched on her nose, cell phone pressed to her ear as she tried to breeze past the locked cattle gate I had installed overnight. It wasn't just any gate. I had welded it myself, reinforced steel with a padlock thick enough to stop a tractor, the kind of gate you couldn't ignore, couldn't pretend wasn't there. When she saw it blocking the road, she slammed on her brakes so hard dust flew up around her tires and she stormed out, barking into her phone that she'd call legal immediately. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, waiting, and when she spotted me, she stomped over, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "This is obstruction," she snapped, her voice tight with outrage. "You can't just block a community road like this." I pulled the certified survey out of my back pocket, unfolded it slowly, and handed it to her like a weapon. "It's not a community road," I said evenly. "It's mine. You fenced yourselves in, Karen. If you want out, you'll have to come through me." She scanned the document, her lips tightening, then shoved it back at me with a scoff, but I saw the tremor in her hand. That tremor told me more than her words ever could. She knew she was beaten, but her pride wouldn't let her admit it. The days that followed turned into a standoff. Homeowners trying to drive to work found themselves staring at my locked gate, their shiny sedans lined up in the morning sun like ducks in a row, and one by one they'd shuffle out, embarrassed, to ask if I could let them through. I did, but on my terms. I opened the gate slowly, deliberately, making sure every driver understood whose land they were crossing. Some thanked me awkwardly, some muttered under their breath, but all of them knew the truth. The HOA had no power here. Every click of that padlock was a reminder. Karen, of course, tried to rally the troops. She held emergency HOA meetings in her driveway, barking orders and spewing promises about how they'd resolve this legally, but the more she talked, the more cracks appeared in her armor. Members began questioning her leadership, whispering about wasted dues, asking why they hadn't double-checked the boundaries before spending thousands on a fence. And all the while, I stayed calm, letting their frustration fester like a storm gathering on the horizon. It wasn't long before their lawyer sent me a letter, pages of bluster claiming easement rights and community necessity. But I'd prepared for that. I took the letter straight to my own attorney, a sharp old ranch lawyer named Dalton who'd been fighting land disputes since before I was born. He chuckled as he read it, tossed it on his desk, and said, "They're bluffing. They don't have a leg to stand on. You hold the deed, the survey proves it, and the county records back you up. If they push this in court, they'll lose. Badly." Hearing that was like tightening the cinch on a saddle. Secure, steady, unshakable. I left Dalton's office with a new kind of confidence. Not only did I have the moral high ground, I had the legal one too. Karen, though, wasn't. Done. One morning, I found fresh tire tracks by the fence line where someone had tried to cut across the pasture to bypass the gate. My blood boiled. They'd driven over my grass, left ruts in the soil, and spooked my cattle. I knew exactly who had authorized it. Karen couldn't stand the thought of asking me for access every day. So I set up cameras, motion sensors, even drove steel posts into the ground along the fence line to make sure no car could slip through again. Then, the next morning, when Karen herself tried to inch her SUV over the grass, I was waiting. I stepped out from behind the barn, camera in hand, recording every second as she spun her tires uselessly in the dirt. "Trespassing," I called, out, my voice echoing across the pasture. "Keep it up, and the sheriff will be here next time." She froze, face red, then reversed slowly, muttering curses I couldn't quite hear. Later that afternoon, I uploaded the footage to a private Facebook group that most of the subdivision was in. Within hours, homeowners were commenting, some mocking her recklessness, others furious that their HOA president was making things worse. Her credibility crumbled in real time. Meanwhile, I decided to up the ante. If they wanted access to my road, I'd make them feel the weight of that privilege. I posted a sign by the gate, "Private access, permission required," and from then on, I controlled the flow like a toll booth. When dawn broke over the ranch that morning, the first thing I heard wasn't the usual sounds of cattle lowing or the faint trickle of the creek. It was the impatient honking of cars stacked along the gravel road outside the gate, a line of sedans and SUVs stretching back toward the subdivision, homeowners desperate to leave for work, school, and errands, but trapped because the only road in and out of their manicured paradise now ran through my locked gate. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the power fully settle into my hands. I took my time that morning, brewed my coffee slow, let the steam curl into the kitchen air, sat down to a full breakfast of eggs and bacon, and only after I'd had my fill did I saddle my horse and ride down to the gate, where Karen herself was pacing like a lioness in a cage, her arms waving as she barked orders at the line of cars behind her. The moment she saw me, she stormed forward, her sunglasses hiding her eyes but not her fury, and she snapped, "You can't keep us locked in here like prisoners!" I leaned forward on the saddle, calm as a man watching a storm roll across the plains, and said, "Correction, Karen. You put yourselves here when you built on my land. I'm just reminding you who owns the road." Her jaw tightened. The other board members hovered behind her like nervous vultures, and the murmurs of the trapped homeowners swelled, anger not just at me but at the people who had led them into this mess. For weeks, I'd let them stew, opening the gate when I pleased, sometimes not at all until noon, forcing them to realize just how much they depended on me. And every day that passed, more of them turned against the HOA board, against Karen, whispering at neighborhood gatherings, leaving angry messages in her inbox. Now, the cracks were turning into full-on fractures. That morning, after making her wait an extra 10 minutes just to prove the point, I finally swung open the gate, and the cars rolled past, their drivers giving me apologetic waves while shooting daggers at Karen, and I knew the end was coming. But I didn't want just a victory. I wanted a lesson carved so deep that no HOA, no board, no smug neighbor would ever think of crossing me or any rancher like me again. So I called a town hall meeting at the local Grange, a place with wooden floors worn smooth by decades of cowboy boots, where generations of my family had hosted cattle auctions and branding celebrations. And I invited every homeowner from the subdivision, every board member, and even the county officials who had signed off on my boundary survey. The night of the meeting, the hall was packed, the air thick with tension, Karen sitting in the front row with her arms crossed tight like she was trying to keep herself from unraveling. When I took the podium, I laid everything out: the deeds, the maps, the survey, the sheriff's testimony, piece by piece until the story of their trespass and arrogance was undeniable. And when I was finished, the hall was silent, except for the sound of shifting feet and whispered curses aimed not at me, but at the HOA board. Then I dropped the final hammer. From that day forward, access through my land would come at a price, a legally binding easement agreement that put me in full control of the gate, the hours, and the maintenance, and every household would pay a monthly fee directly to me for the privilege of using my road. You could feel the collective gasp, the shock of realizing their fate was sealed, and Karen shot to her feet, shouting that it was extortion, that I couldn't possibly get away with it. But before she could launch into one of her tirades, the county clerk in the back stood up and said loud enough for all to hear, "He can and he will. The land is his, and you built where you had no right. Consider yourselves lucky he's even offering you access." The applause that followed wasn't for Karen, wasn't for the HOA board. It was for me, for the rancher who had stood his ground and turned their arrogance into their downfall. That night, contracts were signed, the HOA board fractured beyond repair, and Karen, red-faced and humiliated, was forced to scribble her signature on the easement agreement, the pen trembling in her hand as she realized she had gone from self-appointed queen of the subdivision to nothing more than a tenant begging permission to cross my land. The victory wasn't loud or vengeful. It was quiet, final, like the settling of dust after a storm. And as I rode home under the stars that night, I felt the land breathe with me, like it knew justice had been served. In the weeks that followed, the HOA collapsed under the weight of its own infighting. Karen resigned in disgrace, and the homeowners who once sneered at my ranch now waved respectfully when they passed through the gate, always careful to stay on my good side. The road that had once been theirs in practice was now mine in law and spirit, and every morning as the sun rose and the subdivision cars lined up at the gate, I decided when to open it, not out of malice anymore, but as a reminder, a symbol, carved into their daily routine that this land belonged to me, and no piece of paper, no title, no HOA rule would ever change that. And sometimes, when Karen herself had to drive past, no longer in power but just another face in the line, I would tip my hat and watch her avoid my eyes, because she knew as well as I did, she had tried to fence off my ranch, and now she'd spend the rest of her days living with the fact that I was the one holding the keys.